Hello, everyone.
Oh,
Thanks for having me here. In this presentation, I'm going to present the results from our project titled Stress with Racial Discrimination Roots, a Cluster Analysis. This is a new approach that we use in this study. As we know that racial discrimination is one of the most important risk factors in general health among racialized communities. The studies have shown that there is a high prevalence of racial discrimination in racialized groups. For instance, in the USA, we have a study conducted by Lee and colleagues in 2019. They showed that there is around 50 to 75% prevalence of racial discrimination among Black, Hispanic, and Asian people. And in Canada, a study conducted by Sena and colleagues in 2022 among Black individuals, they showed that there is around 39 to 53% prevalence of racial discrimination among Black individuals in different aspects, which included education, neighborhood, police, health settings, and other aspects. And in another study conducted by Qatar in 2022, they report a high prevalence of racial discrimination among Black and Indigenous people. So it was the highest prevalence compared to other racialized groups in Canada. Experience of racial discrimination is associated with mental health problems and physical health problems. For instance, it is associated with higher levels of depression, higher level of PTSD, which is post-traumatic distress disorder, and depression and anxiety, for instance, and stress as well. It is also connected to physical problems such as pain, cardiovascular diseases, and cancer. There is something missing in the previous studies, which is the analytical approach that all those studies have used so far, which they use a group-centered approaches. For instance, they use mean comparisons, correlations, let's say a Pearson correlation, or they use regression analysis such as logistic regression, ordinal regression, or linear regression, depending on the outcome variable they use. So one thing is missing is that approach. So we need another approach to find out the individual differences clearly, which we cannot find in the group-centered approaches as a statistical procedure. So in the current study, to explore better the profile features related to stress, to identify clusters of individuals who exhibit similar stress profile in response to racial discrimination, and in order to understand how racial discrimination relates to stress and to highlight the heterogeneity in the stress experiences across racialized groups, including Black individuals, including Indigenous people, Asian, Latin Americans, and other groups. We use a person-centered approach, which is called cluster analysis. Based on this purpose, we had two main research questions. The first one was that, is there a distinct pattern of stress associated with experiences of racial discrimination? If there is this association, there is this distinct cluster or pattern, whether the patterns of stress related to racial discrimination differ across the racialized groups or not. In order to conduct this study, we recruited 4,220 participants, a very large sample. So I ensure that these results are so valid because of the large sample size and a statistical power that we observe. After that, I will show you. The participant included 13% Black individuals, 45% white individuals, 11% Arab, 7% Asian, 13% indigenous, 1% mixed, and around 8% from other racialized groups like Latin Americans, Turkish, Iranian, Persian, and other groups. These are the measures that we use in the current study. Participant completed a socio-demographic form. They also completed a stress sub-scale from depression and anxiety stress scale, which contained 21 items. They also completed resilience that included 2 items. We also used 2 measures to measure racial discrimination, included everyday racial discrimination and measure experience of racial discrimination. And this is the statistical procedure that we use in the current study. So to satisfy the first purpose of this study, which was to use a person-centered approach, we use a cluster analysis using k-means in order to determine the optimal number of the clusters. We use gap statistics, and also in order to compare the means within and between the clusters, we use ANOVA, a series of ANOVA tests, and also as a follow-up to test the prevalence of cluster membership between the racialized groups, we use chi-square test. As we see here, this is the result from the gap statistics. So what we can see here, 3 cluster solution was determined by this gap statistics. So we extracted 3 clusters based on the variable that we had in this study. Cluster 1 included 56% of the individuals, and cluster 2 included 19% of the individuals, and cluster 3 included 24% of the individuals. So what we can see here in this graph, for cluster 1, which is the blue line, we have low levels of stress. We have low levels of racial discrimination in both measures, and we have high levels of resilience. So we called it as low stress cluster. So there are around 56% participants who cluster into cluster 1. So they don't have a high level of stress, but low level of stress and low levels of racial discrimination, but high levels of resilience. And cluster 2, the red line, you see that. So there was a high levels of stress and high levels of racial discrimination, but low levels or intermediate levels of resilience. So we found a cluster for the first time that there is 19% participant who were clustered in that cluster. So based on this feature, we call this cluster as a stress with racial discrimination roots or sources. And we had another cluster, which is cluster 3, the green one. We found high levels of stress, but low levels of racial discrimination and low levels of resilience. And what we can say that there is a cluster which shows that there are people who have stress, but there is no roots related to racial discrimination. These results were significant, so we found a main effect for this result, indicate that the overall means of the measure were not the same within the clusters. We also found significant interaction between clusters and mean scores that indicates the pattern of the measure depends on the cluster membership. So there were differences between the clusters. It shows the differences between the clusters. And this is the summary of the result we found based on the cluster analysis, the k-means. So we called the first cluster low stress. We called the second one stress with racial discrimination roots. And the third one is stress without racial discrimination roots. As a follow-up, we wanted to compare the cluster membership between the racialized groups to see which racial group has more membership in these three clusters. So we conducted a three-way interaction between the clusters indicators, which were the measures that we had, and race groups. And the results were significant. And we see the eta square, which is 0.42. It means that there was a large effect size because of the sample size was very large, right? And to follow up, the chi-square tests were conducted to compare the cluster membership between the race groups. And this is the results. What we found here for cluster one, first of all, the highest membership was for white people and mixed group for cluster one, which is low stress. And cluster two, which was stress with racial discrimination roots, we found the highest membership among Black individuals and indigenous people. So it means that these people are more prone to experience stress with racial discrimination roots or sources compared to other racialized groups. And for cluster three, which was just stress without racial discrimination, it was found that the higher one was for Arabs and other groups. Based on the current results, what we can say. So we have this result in hand, and what's the implications to have these results? The first thing is that these results help us to develop a new scale or a screening measure in order to assess the stress with racial discrimination roots. There is no measure that assessing this cluster. And this measure and these clusters will help us for our clinical assessment in order to adopt our intervention or preventive programs based on that clusters when we have visitors that has this problem, for instance. We also need to take this experienced racial discrimination into account for our interventions as well. We also need to consider resilience as a common indicator. Why I'm saying common indicator? Because of this graph. Remember that I said that resilience was low in cluster 2 and cluster 3. So it means that the resilience is the common factor and it's not really related to what type of stress that we experience. So in any type of preventive program, in any type of intervention program, we should consider resilience as one of the most important factors in our assessment and in our intervention. And regarding the future research directions, we need more studies to validate this criterion, which is about the stress with racial discrimination roots. We also need further study to refine assessment techniques and identify the most effective interventions concerning the stress with racial discrimination roots. And we also need to take socio-demographic backgrounds into account for our future research. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. For the use of the cluster association with the k-means, is that a frequently used task for like evaluating the demographics? Is that like used a lot?
So you mean the cluster, why you use the cluster analysis?
Yes, is it used a lot? Because I haven't seen it.
Yeah. The cluster analysis is an unsupervised learning technique that we usually use it when we want to explore the within individual differences that we might not see this approach in a lot of papers, especially in this field. So this is one of the approaches that I really like to use because it shows something important like the cluster. So when, for instance, when we have DSM-5, we define some cluster regarding some specific disorders. So it is one of the approaches that a researcher can use to define define assessment and define the intervention and define the classification regarding the disorder.
There's one we don't see like why, and you don't see it used a lot because it's so.
Yeah, it's very advanced statistical approach, but unfortunately, yes, there is not a lot of this researchers using this approach. Yeah, that's why. It is one of the reasons.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a very interesting research topic. I have a question about just with the 3 clusters. I can see that it seems, now I'm not very good in statistics, but it seems like the way the research is set up, it's causal based on, the everyday racial discrimination and major experience of racial discrimination. And it's causing these shifts in the resiliency factor. I wonder if there's any research or if you've read on what could be certain mediators for resilience in this context, and how that could help practical implications.
So first of all, in this approach, we are not looking to find the mediators or moderators because it's just exploring some within group features or differences, as I said. But if we look at the previous studies, maybe we find resilience as one of the mediators for such relationships. For instance, we have racial discrimination because it is an exposure that people usually experience. So we have that exposure as X, which is our independent variable, and we have our outcome, which is the stress level, and we can have resilience as the mediator. But this approach is not measuring the mediation. Yeah.
Any other question? What will be next?
The next thing is I'm going to develop a measure, a screening tool to assess and measure the stress with racial discrimination roots. This is the next thing.